Second, now we move on to the e-commerce space. Now, the e-commerce space right now is a little complex in terms of how the legislations are developing. The first thing that we have is the e-commerce rules. So I think this is something that we did discuss earlier in a previous lecture, that the e-commerce rules. So how the genesis has developed, just to give a rewind, is that we have a new Consumer Protection Act that came out in 2019, which updated or was an update on the previous Consumer Protection Act. Now, under the Consumer Protection Act in 2020, a new consumer protection e-commerce rules were brought out, which were only applicable for e-commerce companies and, of course, platforms and sellers who are on e-commerce platforms. Now, in 2021, an amendment to these rules was considered, and that was a conversation which was discussed in the government and the ministry very extensively, because the amendment rules had a lot of issues with them. There were a lot of jurisdiction overlaps. The amendment rules, the copy of it is available online. You can see had a lot of provisions where it kind of infringed, I wouldn't say infringed, or let's say expanded its scope beyond what a consumer protection rule should be like. They were talking about competition. They were talking about not privacy. They were talking about usage of data. They were talking about predatory pricing, abuse of dominant position. So those rules, those amendment rules, did not sit well with a lot of people, including some quarters of the government. I do remember, for example, the Niti Aayog came out strongly in the public domain and said that these amendment rules need to be reconsidered, because they're not going to sit well in the legislative framework right now of India. So they were tabled back then. So there was not a lot of update on that aspect back then. So the understanding in the policy ecosystem has been that those amendment rules, even though they've been released in the public domain, they've now been shelved and nothing is going to happen on that. However, what we've been seeing in the past few days now, interestingly, is that there is conversation in the media and there is conversation in the ministry that some sort of new e-commerce rules again may be introduced by the the Department of Consumer Affairs. The idea here is that, again, the intention of these rules that they're now talking about is, of course, to maybe have some sort of imposition of inventory-based sales. That has been a major contention in the consumer protection debate, that a platform who is selling items on its portal, should they be allowed to have an inventory of the same product or not? Because then there's a conflict of interest. Because are you a platform or are you a seller at that stage? So that's a conversation, and that is something that the FDI law of India talks about. That is something that the Competition Act of India tries to curtail to a certain extent. And now that is something that the e-commerce rules under the Department of Consumer Affairs domain is also trying to look at. So they are now talking about a new set of e-commerce rules altogether, which will have, let's say, certain penalties for e-commerce platforms and companies, ban on maybe inventory-based sales, flash sales, etc. How the grievance redressal mechanism for consumer on e-commerce platforms. Now, what's not clear right now is that the rules that they're now talking about, which are now being reported in the media, are these going to be, let's say, there are three possibilities, right? One possibility is that the e-commerce amendment rules, which we had in 2021, have now been shared, and this is a new set of e-commerce amendment rules, right? That's one possibility. The other possibility is that the e-commerce amendment rules that they came out earlier, they're updating that draft itself and then coming out with an updated draft. The third possibility, which is of course less likely but might just happen, is that this is a new set of e-commerce rules altogether. So the rules that exist right now, which came out in 2020, may be defunct and a new set of rules may come in. So there's no clarity right now on how this happens. But the idea is that the e-commerce rules under the domain of the Consumer Protection Act, there is going to be some activity on it this year. And the rules that exist right now under that act are going to be updated in one form or another. So what we should be looking forward to is that how, as a consumer, my rights or my duties as a seller or as a platform are going to be affected in this transaction in regards to what the Department of Consumer Affairs and DPIIT are looking at. So that's the important piece of legislation, or that's the important piece of development, which is going to develop this year.